In 1985, Mossad quietly created a construction company that didn't actually build anything ordinary. On the surface, it won contracts to renovate embassies across Europe. In reality, it was slipping listening devices deep inside the walls during renovation and walking away with buildings that whispered every secret conversation straight into Mossad receivers in Tel Aviv. For 9 years, this fake company infiltrated 17 embassies belonging to 5 different Arab nations. And the most unbelievable part? Nobody noticed a single thing. Until one electrician spotted something that should never have been there. This is the story of one of the most daring technical surveillance operations ever attempted. How Israeli intelligence built an entire construction business from nothing. How they beat real companies in competitive bids. How unsuspecting workers installed spy gear with their own hands. And how one oversight in Brussels caused the entire operation to implode in spectacular fashion. If you're into real espionage stories that sound impossible but actually happened, make sure you stay till the end. And hit subscribe right now, because the next operation we cover makes this one look almost simple. Now let's rewind to the early 1980s. This era is remembered as the peak of the Cold War. But from Israel's perspective, the immediate threat wasn't Moscow, it was the ring of Arab states surrounding them. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya, Saudi Arabia. Some openly hostile, others quietly undermining Israel behind diplomatic smiles. Israel urgently needed to know, were these nations preparing for coordinated attacks? Were they bankrolling extremist groups? Were they developing new weapons? What strategies were they discussing when no one was watching? Signals intelligence, intercepting phone calls and communications, had always been Israel's strength. But by the 1980s, Arab governments had grown smarter. Encrypted lines, secure radio systems, carefully crafted protocols. Most sensitive discussions never touched electronic communication. But there was one place where even the most guarded officials spoke freely, inside their own embassy walls. Embassies are considered sovereign territory. Guards watch every entrance. Security sweeps happen routinely. No foreign intelligence agency is supposed to get anywhere near classified rooms. If you could bug an embassy from the inside, you could hear conversations that were never meant to be overheard. You could learn strategies never written down. You could understand what a government intended long before they acted. But there was a problem. Planting bugs inside an embassy from the outside is almost impossible. Unless you're invited inside, unless the embassy asks you to enter. Unless you're not a spy sneaking in the shadows, but a trusted contractor with legitimate authorization. That was the brilliance of what Mossad designed. They wouldn't break into embassies. They would be hired to renovate them. The idea was born in 1985 inside Mossad's Technical Operations Division. What if they created a construction company that specialized in embassy renovation? What if they won contracts fair and square? And what if during routine upgrades, they embedded listening devices behind fresh drywall and inside conduits? It sounded almost absurd. Building a fake construction company good enough to fool embassy procurement teams? Winning official contracts against real businesses? Installing surveillance gear without a single worker realizing what they were doing? It seemed impossible. But the more the team examined it, the more it looked like the perfect long-term infiltration tool. Because embassies constantly needed repairs. Walls crack. Wiring ages. security systems need upgrades, and only specialized construction firms with the right credentials are allowed to work inside. If Mossad could create a company that looked fully legitimate, with history, paperwork, credibility, and expertise, they could effectively walk into the most secure rooms in the world and leave behind invisible ears. Planning began immediately. Unlike previous front companies Mossad had created, this one required real craftsmanship. Construction isn't theoretical. You must produce visible results. You can't fake electrical wiring or plumbing. You need qualified workers, real equipment, and actual engineering knowledge. They also needed a city where embassies were clustered close together. The answer was obvious: Brussels. Brussels is one of the most diplomatically dense cities on Earth. EU headquarters, NATO headquarters, and dozens of embassies all operate there. A construction company based in Brussels, specializing in embassy renovation, would never seem suspicious. In fact, it would seem like a smart business strategy. The company Mossad created became known publicly as a Belgian construction firm. We'll call it Eurobuild Construction. The real name remains legally protected. Eurobuild was officially registered in 1985. On paper, it was owned by a well-established Belgian businessman with a long history in construction management. He was real, he had verifiable credentials, but he was also a long-term Mossad asset, not Israeli, not Jewish. Just someone whose vulnerabilities Mossad had quietly discovered and leveraged years earlier. He became the perfect frontman, a respected local figure who could meet clients, negotiate bids, and sign contracts without raising any alarm. Behind him, everything was orchestrated by Mossad. Funds came through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to look like normal business investment. Senior leadership, project managers, engineers, security coordinators were actually Mossad officers using expertly forged European identities. Their biographies were deep and believable. Fake families, fake employment histories, fake education records, nothing sloppy. Then came the most important step: hiring real construction workers, electricians, carpenters, plumbers, site supervisors, all legitimate professionals who genuinely believed they were joining a promising Brussels construction firm. None of them knew they were about to help build one of the most successful intelligence collection networks in Europe. This detail is essential. Eurobuild had to operate like a real high-quality construction company. If they produced bad work or missed deadlines, embassies would never hire them again. Competent execution was critical for the espionage to succeed. For the first year, Eurobuild didn't even touch embassy projects. They completed ordinary commercial renovations, offices, retail spaces, small government buildings, building a portfolio, establishing credibility, gaining references. Mossad understood that in espionage, patience is a weapon. They were creating a company that needed to look indistinguishable from any legitimate business. And by the end of that year, Eurobuild Construction appeared exactly that. A competent, reliable Belgian firm with good workers, solid reputation, and a growing client list. No one had any reason to suspect what was coming next. Office renovations, retail build-outs, apartment repairs. Eurobuild handled everything. Every ordinary project helped them build a spotless track record. They needed references, credibility, and a reputation that looked completely natural. Because once they began bidding on embassy contracts, those embassies would investigate every detail. They'd call former clients, they'd verify Eurobuild's past work, and, crucially, everything had to check out. And by early 1986, it did. Eurobuild had become known as a competent, reliable construction firm in Brussels. They had dozens of completed projects, satisfied clients who'd vouch for them, and all the required business licenses and insurance. Nothing about them suggested espionage. They looked exactly like what they claimed to be, which is why Mossad knew the moment had come to aim at their real mission. Embassies. Their first target was the embassy of an Arab country. I'll call it Country A for safety reasons. Even today, naming it publicly could spark diplomatic fallout. But this country was deeply hostile toward Israel. It funded anti-Israeli groups. Its diplomatic conversations would be gold for Mossad analysts. And its embassy in Brussels was old. A 1960s building with failing electrical systems, outdated plumbing, and interior spaces that desperately needed modernization. The government approved a major renovation budget and issued a request for proposals. Companies were invited to bid. Eurobuild submitted one of them. They weren't the cheapest bids that would have looked suspicious, but their bid was professional, detailed, and extremely well structured. They demonstrated expertise in high-security construction environments. They listed strong references. They held every certification an embassy would expect. Country A reviewed the bids and selected Eurobuild. Not because of espionage. Not because they were manipulated. They simply looked like the best combination of price, quality, and reliability. The contract was signed. And that's when the real operation began. Eurobuild assigned a project manager, a Mossad officer operating under a forged identity. Let's call him Cohen. He had specialized training in both construction management and covert technical surveillance. He understood how buildings worked and how to hide listening devices inside them without leaving a trace. Cohen put together a mixed team. Most of the workers were ordinary Eurobuild employees, real electricians, carpenters, and plumbers who believed they were just renovating another embassy. But inside that group were 3 Mossad technical specialists, disguised as regular electricians and communications technicians. Their real job? Install covert surveillance equipment into the structure of the building itself. And the devices they used were nothing like the bugs you see in movies. These were advanced tools built directly into the building's infrastructure. For example, modified electrical outlets. To anyone else, the outlet looked and behaved like a completely normal plug. You could plug in a lamp and it would work. But buried deep in the wiring was a tiny microphone and transmitter, powered directly by the electrical system, requiring no battery, no maintenance. It sent audio on a narrow frequency that Mossad receivers could pick up from nearby apartments. Light fixtures were retrofitted in similar ways, functional, harmless in appearance, but carrying microtransmitters inside the metal housing. Ventilation grills that appeared to be part of the standard air circulation system actually contained hidden microphones. They blended so perfectly into the design that even embassy security sweeps wouldn't detect them. And because Eurobuild's contract involved a full renovation, they had unrestricted access to walls, ceilings, wiring, telecom systems, everything. They could go anywhere, open anything, inspect every hidden corner of the embassy, all with full legal permission. The ordinary construction workers did their jobs normally, painting, drywalling, fixing pipes, never realizing they were standing side by side with Mossad operatives installing one of the most ambitious bugging networks in Western Europe. Over 4 months, Cohen's team installed 17 surveillance devices across the embassy, each one deliberately placed to catch high-level conversations. The ambassador's office, diplomatic meeting rooms, secure communication areas, anywhere sensitive talk might happen. When construction finished, Country A's embassy inspected the renovation. Everything looked perfect. The work was clean, modern, professionally executed. All systems functioned flawlessly. Every requirement in the contract had been met. Eurobuild was paid in full. And the moment the doors closed behind the last worker, every conversation inside that building began quietly flowing toward Tel Aviv. Mossad had rented several apartments and office spaces within a few hundred meters of the embassy, close enough to receive the hidden transmissions. The audio was recorded, encrypted, and sent to Israel, where analysts listened to every word. Suddenly, Israel had direct access to Country A's diplomatic inner circle. They heard what the ambassador reported back home, what instructions he received, what secret negotiations were underway, which regional alliances were forming, what intelligence country shared with its allies, and what they planned next, behind closed doors. This single embassy provided an avalanche of information. Information that influenced Israeli diplomatic decisions, military planning, and counterterrorism strategy for years. And Country A never suspected a thing. They had hired Eurobuild voluntarily. They paid them. They inspected their work. They trusted them. That's the terrifying brilliance of the operation. And because it worked flawlessly once, Mossad expanded it. If they could infiltrate one embassy this way, why not two? Why not five? Why not every high-value Arab embassy in Europe? Eurobuild was now a weapon disguised as a construction firm. And this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Eurobuild quietly bid on and won renovation contracts at 6 additional embassies across Brussels, and every single time the pattern stayed the same, almost hypnotically consistent. Real construction workers did real renovation work. Legitimate electricians fixed wiring. Plumbers repaired pipes. Carpenters renovated offices, nothing unusual on the surface, but hidden among them, like shadows disguised in daylight, were Mossad technical specialists. Men with false identities, forged credentials, and skills far beyond anything a normal construction worker would possess. Their actual job was never written on paper. They were there to install surveillance equipment so seamlessly that even experts wouldn't notice. The embassies they targeted belonged to several Arab countries, each strategically chosen. Sometimes Eurobuild won through completely fair competitive bidding. Other times they benefited from something almost comical. Satisfied embassies recommended Eurobuild, completely unaware they were recommending the very company spying on them. By 1988, Eurobuild had successfully compromised 7 embassies in Brussels alone. But Israel was nowhere near satisfied. The intelligence they were receiving was so valuable, so strategically potent, that Mossad decided to expand the operation beyond Belgium. They opened branch offices of Eurobuild in Paris, London, and Amsterdam, cities with dense clusters of embassies and diplomatic facilities, each full of sensitive conversations Mossad wanted access to. The business model never changed. The method never changed. The cover never broke. On the surface, a loyal, hard-working European construction company. Underneath, one of the most ambitious espionage networks ever built. In each city, Eurobuild hired local labor, bought materials from local suppliers, and took on normal commercial jobs first. Office renovations, warehouse upgrades, small business remodels, all meant to build a spotless reputation. Then, when the timing was right, they quietly bid on embassy contracts. The expansion worked better than Mossad ever expected. In Paris, Eurobuild won renovation contracts at 3 embassies. In London, 4 embassies. In Amsterdam, 3 more. By 1991, the number was staggering. 17 embassies compromised across 4 European capitals. Every single one an Arab embassy Israel needed to monitor. Every single one paying Eurobuild with a smile. And the intelligence? It was some of the most valuable Mossad had ever collected in that era. They gained access to secret diplomatic communications, the kind of candid conversations that never happened over phones or encrypted systems. They learned how these governments negotiated behind closed doors, what they planned before international summits, and how they assessed Israel's actions in the region. This intelligence directly influenced Israel's military decisions, diplomatic maneuvers, and even its approach to early peace talks. It provided a strategic vantage point no traditional spy infiltration could match. But here's the brutal truth of intelligence work. Every operation has an expiration date, not because the planners fail, but because the world is unpredictable. And eventually something can, or someone, will go wrong. Eurobuild lasted 9 years, far longer than most large-scale front companies ever survive. But in 1994, the operation began to unravel, not because of a brilliant counterintelligence move, but because of a worker who noticed something that didn't fit. Eurobuild had just won a contract to renovate another embassy in Brussels, this time belonging to an African country closely connected to several Arab nations. For Mossad, this embassy was a gold mine. Diplomats from multiple regions visited it regularly. The renovation was routine. Same pattern, same cover, same embedded Mossad specialists. But one man, an experienced electrician who had spent 2 years with Eurobuild, noticed something off. He was installing standard electrical outlets, exactly as the project blueprints instructed, but in one room he arrived to find an outlet someone else had already installed. As protocol required, he opened it up to check the wiring. Inside, he froze. There were extra wires that connected to nothing he recognized. And tucked into the corner of the box was a tiny circuit board, one that didn't resemble any electrical component he'd ever seen. He casually asked the supposed electrician who had installed it, one of the Mossad tech specialists, what the extra wiring was for. The specialist didn't flinch. He offered a smooth explanation. It's a surge protection module. Embassies have sensitive electronics. They require special safeguards. But the electrician wasn't convinced. He'd been doing this for 15 years. He'd installed thousands of outlets in dozens of buildings, including embassies. And he had never, ever seen surge protection that looked like this. He stayed quiet. He didn't argue. But the doubt stayed with him. Over the next few days, he noticed a pattern he somehow hadn't seen before. The same 3 specialists always handled electrical and communication wiring. They never allowed regular workers to finalize those installations. They deflected questions. They worked alone whenever possible. Curiosity became suspicion. Suspicion turned into concern. Then he did something that sealed the fate of the entire operation. He took a photo of the strange wiring with his personal camera. A few days later, he showed the photo to a friend who worked for a Belgian security firm. The friend looked closely, frowned, and said, "This isn't electrical equipment. Some of these components look like transmitters." That was it. The electrician realized he might be in the middle of something far bigger than a renovation project. He went straight to the Belgian police. He explained what he'd found. He explained his concerns. He explained that he believed his company, unknowingly or intentionally, might be installing surveillance equipment inside embassies. Belgian police took it seriously. Very seriously. Bugging an embassy isn't just a crime, it's a diplomatic nightmare. They immediately contacted Belgian intelligence and opened a joint investigation. What they discovered was the beginning of the end. Eurobuild's ownership trail was a hall of mirrors. Shell companies owned by shell companies owned by anonymous funds in multiple jurisdictions. Nothing pointed directly at Israel, but everything felt deliberately obscured. Investigators checked the backgrounds of senior managers. Some identities didn't fully verify. Employment histories were incomplete. Certain passport stamps didn't match work records. Belgian intelligence began to suspect a foreign intelligence operation. Russian, American, Chinese. They didn't know yet. Then one investigator noticed something small but suspicious. Several Eurobuild senior staff had a pattern of frequent travel to Israel. This was a massive red flag. Construction managers had no reason to visit Israel multiple times a year. Belgian intelligence reached out to Israeli authorities, who firmly denied knowing the individuals in question. But the Belgian analysts weren't convinced. The patterns were too structured, too intentional. Meanwhile, the embassies themselves began to panic. Rumors spread that Belgian police were investigating Eurobuild. Several embassies ordered emergency technical sweeps. One by one, they found the hidden devices: modified outlets, fake air vents, light fixtures with embedded microphones. Once they knew what to look for, the pattern became obvious. The scandal exploded across Europe. 17 embassies in 4 countries had been compromised. It became one of the largest espionage exposures in European history. Embassies demanded answers, governments demanded explanations. And every piece of evidence, no matter how veiled, pointed toward Mossad. Israel officially denied everything. But nobody believed the denial. The targeting was too specific, the sophistication too advanced, the methods too precise. And just like that, after 9 years in the shadows, Eurobuild's empire of silent walls began to crumble. The Arab countries whose embassies had been compromised were furious, almost humiliated. They demanded accountability. They wanted arrests, public trials, someone to blame. But there was nobody to put in handcuffs. The people who had actually run the operation had vanished before investigators even knew where to start. The regular construction workers, the electricians, plumbers, carpenters, were just ordinary employees who believed they were working for a normal Belgian company. They couldn't be prosecuted for something they never knew existed. The embassies immediately ripped out every piece of surveillance equipment. They ordered full structural sweeps. They rewired entire buildings. Procedures were overhauled from the ground up. They reviewed every vendor, every contractor, every maintenance request. What had once been routine embassy work suddenly became a high-risk security gamble. And Eurobuild collapsed almost overnight. The facade crumbled. The company was shut down. Belgian authorities seized the remaining assets. Multiple investigations carried on for months. But nothing substantial came from them because the real operators, the Mossad officers, were already gone. For Mossad, it was undeniably a blow. They had been running one of their most effective technical surveillance operations ever, and now it had been thrust into the spotlight. 17 embassy listening posts, lost in an instant. The brilliant method they'd used, building a functioning, profitable construction company as a Trojan horse, was now exposed to the world. They could never use that exact strategy again. But here's the part most people overlook. For 9 years, this operation worked almost flawlessly. The intelligence gathered during those years was priceless. And even though it eventually unraveled, Mossad pulled their people out safely. No arrests, no captured officers, no public trials, no diplomatic disaster that couldn't be denied or deflected. In intelligence terms, that's still considered a success. You run an operation for as long as it brings value, and when exposure becomes unavoidable, you extract your people, close the door behind you, and move on to the next method. The Eurobuild operation became a case study. An example of how far intelligence agencies will go to gain technical access. Think about it. Creating an entire construction company, staffing it with real workers, completing hundreds of legitimate projects, operating normally for nearly a decade, all to secretly install listening devices across 17 embassy buildings. The planning alone was enormous. The resources were significant, and the operational security had to be airtight for almost 10 years. One slip, a single careless moment, could have blown everything wide open years earlier. And here's the unsettling truth. Eurobuild was probably not the only operation of its kind. Intelligence agencies worldwide have almost certainly built similar front companies. Construction firms, cybersecurity providers, HVAC and electrical maintenance companies, IT networking firms, cleaning and maintenance contractors. All of them perfectly legitimate on the surface, yet quietly serving intelligence objectives behind the scenes. These companies employ real people who have no idea they're part of an espionage network. They earn real profits, they build real offices, they file real taxes, and somewhere beneath all that normalcy, they're gathering intelligence or installing surveillance gear in the very buildings they're trusted to maintain. How would you ever know? If the operation is done properly, you can't tell the difference between a real business and an intelligence front. They look identical. They behave identically. They produce professional work. That's why Eurobuild worked so well. It didn't pretend to be a construction company. It truly was a construction company, one that simply had an extra hidden purpose. The workers were real. The contracts were real. The renovations were real. But buried inside all that legitimate business activity was one of the most sophisticated espionage operations Europe had ever seen. It's the kind of operation that intelligence academies study for years. How to build deep cover. How to blend espionage with real business. How to operate in the open without raising suspicion. How to maintain a narrative so convincing that even security agencies never think to question it. When the truth finally came out, the regular workers were stunned. They had genuinely believed they were part of a normal, successful construction firm. Some felt betrayed, used without consent. Others were angry. But some surprisingly felt pride that unknowingly their skills had played a role in a major intelligence story. And then there was the electrician, the man whose curiosity accidentally unraveled a 9-year operation. He became somewhat of a legend in intelligence circles, not because he tried to expose espionage, but because he simply paid attention. A tiny piece of unusual wiring, a detail that didn't fit, and the entire operation unraveled like a loose thread pulled from a sweater. Embassy security protocols worldwide changed after Eurobuild. Sweeps became more frequent. Renovation workers were supervised closely. Background checks became significantly more rigorous. Some countries now forbid foreign contractors entirely. Eurobuild didn't just get exposed. It reshaped global embassy security. But intelligence agencies adapted, as they always do. When one technique becomes obsolete, new ones appear, new fronts, new covers, new ways to slip past the defenses of organizations that believe they're secure. That's how the intelligence game works. Constant evolution. Eurobuild lasted 9 years. In espionage, that's an eternity. The fact that it was eventually discovered doesn't erase what was achieved. Access to strategic diplomatic discussions, insights into Arab foreign policy, intelligence that shaped Israeli decisions, early warnings that influenced military planning, classified information that would never have been obtainable any other way. All because Mossad formed a construction company and convinced embassies to hire them. It's a reminder that intelligence work isn't always about covert raids, dramatic escapes, or cloak and dagger shootouts. Sometimes the most effective method is the quietest one. Build trust. Build relationships. Build a company people rely on. And then, hidden inside that trust, gather the information that changes history. Eurobuild was that idea taken to its highest form. A front so real, so convincing, that even the people being spied on recommended it to others. And here's the chilling part. Somewhere right now, another company, completely ordinary looking, is doing the exact same thing. Different region, different targets, different intelligence service, but the same principle. The best way to get inside is to be invited inside. If you want more stories like this, declassified operations, hidden missions, and intelligence strategies that shaped global history, make sure you subscribe. More untold operations are coming next.